Of workers who work directly or indirectly protecting our nation and trying to provide the services that are so essential to our people. Let's not do any more harm, and let's not waste any more time. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I have not been on the floor during the entire remarks of my friend from Virginia, but I did hear part of it, and I first want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership on behalf of the people of Virginia and on behalf of a sensible way to resolve our budget problems. You have been a leader in building bridges and recognize how devastating sequestration is, not just to the federal workers who live in your state, not just to the people that live in your state, but to our entire country. This is dangerous sequestration, and you really have been a leader in pointing that out. You've also made it very clear that sequestration is mindless, across-the-board cuts, that we have a responsibility to make priority decisions, and when we use sequestration, we're on automatic pilot, but an automatic pilot that can't carry out its current mission, can't safely navigate the air. That's where we are. And I really applaud you for taking on this issue of saying to our friends on both sides of the aisle, let's listen to each other. We know we're divided here. We have different views. But we need to sit down, work together, and come up with a sensible way to balance the federal budget, to give the predictability that's necessary, and to eliminate these sequestration cuts. It's particularly painful right now when we have so many Marylanders, so many Virginians, so many people in this country that are receiving paychecks with a 20% cut, and yet the work they have to do is the same.
Will the Senator yield for a question?
Be glad to.
I just want to thank the Senator from Maryland for his comments, and let me say that no senator has served with more distinction, both here in the Senate and prior to that in the House, in being a constant advocate for federal employees and being willing to step up to protect them and rebut what we too often hear from some of our colleagues, that across the board, without distinction, demean and denigrate the extraordinary good work that so many countless unnamed federal employees do. So I want to thank the Senator from Maryland for that work. I want to thank him for his willingness and continued willingness and conversations with me and others to talk about, hey, we all have to stretch a little ways to get things done, because I know he's hearing the same thing in Maryland. People are not distinguishing red shirt, blue shirt. They want us to get this job done, and I, again, thank the Senator for his good work and look forward to working with him and folks on both sides of the aisle to resolve this issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank my colleague for those comments. I understand you've already mentioned the fact of what's happening at the National Institutes of Health and the fact that because of these sequestration cuts, the number of grants that will be given out this year, contracts with young scientists to do research, are going to be cut by the hundreds. Now, we don't know which one of these researchers would have come up with an advancement on a major breakthrough, but there would have been some, and they're going to be denied. They may get discouraged, the people who would have received these grants, and they may go into other fields. We may lose them forever as far as scientific researchers. They may go to other professions, they may go to other countries. But we know that they're not doing the work they're trained to do, and we know that they had a proposal that went through the most difficult vetting process and was selected for funding and should have been funded but is not being funded because of these sequestration cuts. That we know. That much we know for sure. We also know that it's not just that researcher who's been hurt by these sequestration cuts. It's the businesses that depend upon the basic research, many of which are small companies, in order to build upon that research to create the products that go into the marketplace and create the jobs that are necessary for our economy. There's a direct loss to the economy of our country as a result of these sequestration cuts. So it's time that we move forward and resolve the problems of our country. Let me, if I might, I know and I agree with my friend from Virginia that we got to find a way on both sides of the aisle to come together. But I must point out that it's been extremely difficult, particularly with the climate in the other body. In the current issue of New York Magazine, Jonathan Chait writes, and I quote, "The chaos and dysfunction has set in so deeply that Washington now lurches from crisis to crisis, and once dull, keep the lights on ritual of government procedures are transformed to white-knuckle dramas that threaten national or even global catastrophes. The Republican Party has spent 30 years careering ever more deeply into ideological extremism. But one of the novel developments of the Obama years is the embrace of procedural extremism. The Republican fringe has evolved from being politically shrewd proponents of radical policy changes to a gang of saboteurs who would rather stop government from functioning at all." End quote. Well, this brinkmanship is preventing the economic recovery from gaining steam. It's preventing us from addressing urgent problems, and it's punishing all Americans, not just federal workers. If we come together on behalf of the American people, we can replace sequestration with a measured and balanced approach to deficit reduction. We can agree on a path forward to fiscal solvency that spreads the burden equitably. We can begin to solve our problems instead of compounding them. But I will tell you what we cannot do. We cannot balance the budget on the backs of federal workers. It isn't feasible and it isn't fair. Increasingly, federal workers are asked to do more with less. According to the Office of Management and Budget, the size of the civilian workforce relative to the country's population has declined dramatically over the last several decades, notwithstanding occasional upticks due to military conflicts or the taking of the census. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were on average 92 Americans for every federal worker. In the 1980s and 90s, there were 106 Americans for every federal worker. By 2011, the ratio had increased to 145 Americans for every federal worker. Since the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. population has increased by 76%, and the private sector workforce has risen by 133%. But the size of the federal workforce has risen by just 11%. Relative to the private sector, the federal workforce is less than half the size it was back in the 1950s and 60s. The picture that emerges is one of a federal civilian workforce whose size has significantly shrunk. Compared to the size of the U.S. population, it serves the private sector workforce and the magnitude of federal expenditures. I previously talked about the adverse effect of sequestration on many of our domestic agencies. I've talked a little bit today about the circumstances at NIH. I've talked about the Food and Drug Administration, the Social Security Administration, and other domestic federal agencies. So let me focus, Madam President, if I might, for the next few minutes on the impacts of sequestration on a particular group of federal workers. The Department of Defense civilian employees, who are part of the total force team providing invaluable support to our men and women in uniform serving in harm's way. These proud individuals have in the past few weeks suffered unnecessary hardship due to sequestration. The primary priority of our government is the defense of our nation, and sequestration adversely affects the civilian men and women who help provide that defense. DoD civilians serve our nation by advancing scientific research, providing logistical support to our service members while forward deployed, and ensuring institutional stability within DoD offices as service members rotate to different duty stations. Recently, some of the media have promoted the idea that the $85 billion sequestration cut triggered on March 1st aren't causing drastic effects. CNN called the cuts not as bad as advertised, and the Washington Post reported that the cuts are less scary than predicted. Tell that to the 46,000 DoD employees in Maryland and another 103,000 in the capital region who are being furloughed, losing up to 20% of their weekly pay through the rest of this fiscal year. Earlier this month, the Defense Department began furloughing 652,000 civilian employees nationwide, forcing them to take up to 11 unpaid days off through September. This is in addition to the furloughs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Internal Revenue Service. These furloughs disrupt our national and economic security and put hundreds of thousands of federal workers and their families in financial hardship. Our government cannot continue to provide for the defense of our nation by maintaining such a harmful policy towards our civilian workers. I have visited installations throughout Maryland, and I've heard about and seen the impacts of furloughs of Defense Department and other federal employees and the impact it will have on their ability to carry out their mission. These cuts and furloughs are affecting the ability of the agency to carry out their legal mission. For instance, at Indian Head Naval Service Warfare Center in Charles County, over 1,870 civilian employees, about 97% of the total government civilian workforce, are being forced to take leave without pay 1 day per week. This puts base police, fire protection, safety programs, air operations, air quality programs, and facilities at risk. At Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, furloughs will hit 2,400 Defense Department civilians, 94% of the civilian staff. Walter Reed is the country's top facility for wounded combat soldiers. Its Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation is the largest within the Department of Defense. Its 7 specialty service clinics include 1 for traumatic brain injuries. Soldiers needing expert care might have to wait longer for appointments or being forced to non-military medical facilities, both of which will drive up costs and compromise the quality of care. I can't tell you how many of us have taken the floor to talk about our commitment to make sure our service people get our warriors, our wounded warriors, get the type of treatment that they deserve. Many of us have visited the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and with pride with the services that are being provided. Well, sequestration is hurting us to meet the mission that we promised to the heroes who have served our nation and have now come home and expect that health care to be available to them. At Fort Detrick, 4,900 Defense Department civilians will be furloughed. Those civilians support a multi-government community that conducts biomedical research and development and medical material management that includes everything from advanced bandages to vaccines for soldiers on the battlefield and in military hospitals. That mission is at risk. There is no other place that can carry out the type of advanced lab work that's done at Fort Detrick. Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Harford County's largest employer and home to 11 major commands and more than 80 agencies, has approximately 11,500 DoD civilian employees subject to furlough, about half of APG's workforce. Before sequestration, APG reported contributing more than $400 million in payroll and $500 million in contract annually. I can assure you that that community will be affected, and many businesses will be affected, as well as the mission at APG itself. And then very close to here, Madam President, just a few miles away at Fort Meade, Maryland's largest employer, sequestration is affecting the entire region. Most of its 27,000 DoD civilian employees face furloughs. These furloughs have all sorts of unintended consequences. A furloughed worker, for instance, may have trouble making his or her mortgage or car payments. Reduced creditworthiness may affect a worker's ability to maintain or obtain a security clearance. Is that how we want to treat people who've helped defend us from terrorists? Budget cuts compounded by sequestration will lead to a brain drain in the Defense Department, with some of the best and brightest defense professionals in the federal government deciding to seek opportunities elsewhere. The federal workforce is better educated, older, and more experienced on average than its private sector counterparts. A significant number of federal workers provide their services to the American people at discount. They could command higher salaries in the private sector, but they choose to work for the federal government because they are patriots and they believe in public service. The world is still a dangerous place. In such uncertain times, we cannot afford to let political dysfunction get in the way of ensuring for our national security. Sequestration is harming our national security readiness. Sequestration isn't just about compromising the ability of federal workers to carry out their critical missions on behalf of all Americans. And it isn't just hurting federal workers and their families economically. Private sector businesses and communities across the country are being hurt by the reduced purchasing power of furloughed federal workers. Federal workers are like everyone else. They support the local businesses in their communities, auto dealers, restaurants, dry cleaners, you name it. They all suffer when federal employees suffer. The local economies suffer and the recovery becomes that much harder and slower. We need to stop demonizing and scapegoating and punishing federal workers. We need to replace sequestration with a rational budget. One of the greatest attributes of the American character is pragmatism. Unlike what some other federal employees are actually doing, here in Congress, balancing the budget is not rocket science. We know the various options. Former President Lyndon Johnson was fond of quoting the prophet Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." That is what we need to do. We can acknowledge and respect our differences, but at the end of the day, the American people have entrusted us with governing and with being pragmatic. Let us do our job so federal workers can get back to do their job. Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, it's my understanding that the senator from Arizona wishes to address the chamber about an upcoming motion to recommit the bill. I would yield time to him.
Senator from Arizona.
I thank the chair. And, Madam President, this is the first appropriation bill that we're considering for FY14. Unfortunately, in my view, it gets us off to the wrong foot because of the spending level. The bill spends more than $54 billion. That's about $5 billion above last year's spending level and more than $10 billion over the House proposal for this coming fiscal year. Considering that our debt stands at over $17 trillion, we ought to be spending less, not more, this year. This bill already takes a larger portion of the total spendable, allowable spending compared to last year. People will point out that the budget agreement that we agreed to in 2011 simply sets an aggregate number, and that we can spend whatever we want in certain appropriation bills as long as the total doesn't come over $967 billion. That is true, but it is impossible, and I can say that with experience in the House and now in the Senate, that if you overspend on the initial appropriation bills, that you will somehow cut back in the bills that come later. Often the last bill to come up is a defense bill. Nobody is going to undercut our troops or spend less in a defense bill, but that would be required if we were to stay under the budget control agreement number. And so when we overspend on the initial appropriation bills like this, it simply means one thing, that we're going to bust the budget. I can tell you, to have any credibility with the taxpayers, we've got to stick to the agreement that was agreed to in 2011. We have so far. We even went through the sequester because we couldn't come up with an agreement to prioritize spending. But now to go over on the first appropriation bill, to go over the spending limit, would not set the right precedent moving ahead into the appropriation bills. We've simply got to deal with this debt and deficit, and this isn't the way to go. That's why I support the upcoming motion to recommit that Senator Toomey will offer in a few minutes, that would simply recommit the bill back to the Appropriations Committee and say, come back with something that fits within the Budget Control Act, that is similar to what was spent last year, not overspending by $5 billion. I hope that we'll pass this motion to recommit. I hope that we'll start off on appropriation bills in the Senate on the right foot. And with that, I yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President,
The senator from Maine.
I yield 5 minutes to Senator Hoeven.
Madam President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I'd like to thank the senator from Maine and also wish to express comments in regard to the motion to recommit that we'll be voting on here, I think, around 3 o'clock. THUD is an important bill and includes funding for things that we consider absolute priorities, certainly transportation, roads, bridges, for housing and for other purposes. So we very much want to fund a transportation, housing, and urban development bill. But the problem we've got here is that we haven't agreed as far as the appropriations bills as to an overall total in how much we will spend. And that's really the problem that we're confronting with this legislation. Under the Budget Control Act, the total for all of the appropriations bills cannot exceed $967 billion. That's the law. That's the law. But the majority party is appropriating to $1,058 billion. That's a problem. So as appropriators, we want to go through, prioritize spending, make sure we're funding the things that should be funded, and then for things that are lower priorities, not funding those so we can truly fund the priorities that are important to the American people. The problem is we're not going to be able to do that unless we get an agreement on the total funding level, and that agreement is exactly what the BCA provides, the Budget Control Act provides, and it says specifically $967 billion. That's the law. That's the law. And we have a $17 trillion debt. We have a deficit this year that CBO projects to be in the range of $750 billion. That's a real problem for our country. That's a problem that we have got to address. We've got to get the deficit and the debt under control. And there's two ways to do that. One is to raise revenue, and that comes from economic growth, not higher taxes. It comes from economic growth, getting our economy going. And, of course, the other way to reduce that deficit is to control spending. And that's what a budget is all about, and sticking to that budget. And we ought to have a balanced budget amendment, which I very much support. But what we have right now is the Budget Control Act. It is the law. So the question I ask is why is the majority party saying we are going to appropriate 12 appropriations bills that total $1,078 billion rather than $967 trillion? And how are we going to get our deficit and our debt under control if we don't adhere to the budget guidelines that are set? So the simple point, the very clear point that I want to make is this. As appropriators and as senators, I believe we all want to prioritize funding, make sure we fund the things that are important, like infrastructure, like housing, and other priorities. And for the things that shouldn't be funded, say, okay, we're not going to fund those items. That's the difference between prioritizing and the so-called sequester, the across-the-board cuts, right? But we're headed down a trail right now if we approve this bill as is and bring other appropriation bills to the floor and approve them as they are, the sequester automatically kicks in again. Under the law, the sequester comes right back in and will bring these bills down to a total of $967 billion. So what have we gained? We haven't accomplished what we're trying to do, which is to prioritize the funding. So let's find a way across the aisle to come to an agreement to make sure that we prioritize funding and do so within the BCA limit of $967 billion, because that's what the law says. That's what the law says we have to do. And we need to find a way to come to an agreement. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll. Alexander.
Madam President, I also note the absence of a quorum.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, later this afternoon, Senator Toomey will be offering a motion to recommit the Transportation-HUD appropriations bill back to the Appropriations Committee. Well, I commend Senator Toomey's goal of ensuring that the fiscal year 2014 spending levels comply with the Budget Control Act spending caps. I do not believe that this is the right approach. Now, let me be clear. I voted in the Appropriations Committee, as did every Republican member of that committee, for a top-line level of $960 billion. That is the amount that is in the Budget Control Act. That is law. But this is the very first appropriations bill that has been brought to the Senate floor. We have no idea where we are going to be at the end of the process. The two leaders of the Appropriations Committee have called for regular order, and I commend them for bringing appropriations bills to the floor, starting with this one at a time, for debate, amendment, and full consideration. We have had many amendments filed to this bill. Several of them would reduce spending that's in this bill. One reduces spending by $50 million for the home program. That's being offered by the senator from Arizona. There's another that reduces spending by over $1 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Program. That's not a cut I happen to believe should be made, but that's a legitimate amendment that, if it passes, would reduce spending in this bill by $1 billion. There are other amendments that have been proposed to reduce spending in this bill. So this is turning the process upside down. It is recommitting to committee a bill before we've had the opportunity to determine what the final spending level in the bill is even going to be as a result of the many amendments that have been filed. Furthermore, we are not going to know if we have breached the cap until we finish all of the appropriations bills. Now, I realize that my Democratic colleagues want a far higher spending cap than I do, and then the Budget Control Act provides. But I don't think that we should short-circuit the process when there has been a good faith effort to bring appropriations bills to the floor. What I would propose, Madam President, in lieu of the approach offered by my friend and colleague Senator Toomey, is an amendment which I'm going to file this afternoon that says not later than October 1st, the Committee on Appropriations shall revise the sub-allocations to the subcommittees for fiscal year 2014 such that the sub-allocations comply with the discretionary spending limits that are in the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act, what we refer to as the Budget Control Act, the BCA. So to me, this is the proper way to do it. If at the end of the fiscal year we find that the appropriations bills that have been passed exceed the statutory cap that is in the BCA, then we should reopen the process and reallocate the funds, the ceilings, the caps, across each of the subcommittees and produce bills that comply with the law. And frankly, since current law applies this cap anyway, if we don't do that, sequestration will take effect on January 1st of next year. And I do not think that's a good approach because it treats all programs as if they are the same and does not allow us to set priorities. So, Madam President, I think the approach of the senator from Pennsylvania is premature, a blunt instrument, and there's a reasonable alternative. I think it discourages a return to normal order where we bring the appropriations bills to the floor and where members are free to eliminate whole programs, to cut billions if they wish to do so. And indeed, members have worthwhile amendments that would reduce spending. But to send the bill back to committee before we've even had a chance to consider those amendments and the Senate to work its will, to me, is completely upside down of the way the process should work. Furthermore, I would make the point once again, this is the first appropriations bill. How can we say that the cap is breached when it's the very first bill to be brought before us? And frankly, Madam President, having gone through this process where we did have a freestanding Transportation-HUD bill, and Senator Murray and I went to conference with our House counterparts, we came back with a consensus bill that became law that was in between the amounts that were in the Senate bill and the House bill. So we ended up at a lower level, which we knew we would, and which I will not feel that I'm going out on a limb here in predicting that we would in this case as well, since the Senate bill is higher than the House bill. Why can't we let the process work? Why can't we consider the amendments that have been offered, some of which may well pass and reduce spending? Why can't we go to conference with the House, where I believe additional cuts are probably likely? And why can't we let the appropriations process unfold the way it should be? Why should we short-circuit it now by saying, that's enough, let's return the bill to committee, we don't trust what's going to happen, when there's safeguards that we could put in to ensure that at the end of the day, we will be at the cap of $967 billion. As I said, I will file my amendment this afternoon to give us an actual mechanism to ensure that as of the beginning of the fiscal year, we are at those levels. That's one approach, and I think it's a far better approach. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
Senator from Washington.
I ask unanimous consent the pending amendment be set aside and the following amendments be called up in block. Coburn, number 1756, McCain, number 1803, Bozeman, number 1785, and Udall of Colorado, number 1789, that the amendments be agreed to en bloc and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it's my understanding that we have a Republican senator who is coming to the floor shortly to make a motion to recommit, and I will, just for the information of all members, at some point to be agreed upon, we will dispense with that amendment this afternoon. We're hoping to do it. I know a number of members have asked timing on that, and I will work with the senator and our staffs to try and do that as soon as possible. I know many members are waiting for that. With that, I will suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
Senator from Montana.
Madam President, I ask that further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, just outside this chamber are the likenesses of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and dozens of statesmen cast in bronze and marble. I often look to these individuals for inspiration and quotes when writing a speech. On a recent walk across the Capitol to meet my colleague, Congressman Dave Camp, I passed a giant statue of Andrew Jackson, our nation's 7th president. It was Jackson who famously said, and I quote him, "The wisdom of man never yet contrived a system of taxation that would operate with perfect equality," end quote. Madam President, those words were spoken by Jackson in 1832. More than 100 years later, our nation still struggles with a broken tax system. Our tax code today is inequitable, inefficient, incomprehensible to the overwhelming majority of Americans. It contains nearly 4 million words. 4 million. If someone were to try to read the entire code out loud, it would take them more than 18 uninterrupted days. Not only is the code long, it is maddeningly complex. 42 different definitions of a small business in the code. 42. 15 different tax incentives for higher education. So many that the IRS had to publish a booklet just to explain and simplify the higher education tax incentives. And that book is, here I have it with me, Madam President, that book is 90 pages long, just on the education incentives. There it is. Defy anybody to read it, let alone somebody trying to go to college or a parent trying to help his child go to college. Code is such a labyrinth that 90% of American taxpayers have to use an accountant or some kind of computer software to file their tax returns. Even with all this assistance, it still takes the average taxpayer 13 hours to gather and compile the receipts and forms to comply with the code. The tax code today is also inefficient and unfair. It is riddled with loopholes, deductions that result in more than $1 trillion in lost revenue each year. This complexity in the code is eroding confidence in our economy, creating uncertainty for America's families and businesses. Many Americans think the other guy, a fancy lawyer, could take advantage of the code and pay lower taxes, which means more tax burden on me. It's just not fair. Confidence is eroding. It is also threatening to undermine the competitiveness of the United States in the global marketplace. Harvard Business School did a survey last year asking 10,000 of its graduates who live and conduct businesses around the world about the challenges of doing business in America. These individuals, these 10,000, are leaders on the front lines of the global economy, and they are pessimistic about America's economic future. The vast majority of those surveyed, 71%, expected U.S. competitiveness to deteriorate over the next several years. And what did they identify as the root of America's competitiveness problem? Respondents pointed to America's tax code, to the code as one of the greatest weaknesses in the U.S. business environment. Dig deeper and you learn respondents were deterred from investing in the United States not simply by a higher statutory corporate tax rate, but also by the sheer complexity and uncertain future of the tax code. And I might say, Madam President, I mentioned that report to people with business, Americans, they nod their heads in agreement. That's what they have found themselves to. The survey concludes with a dire warning, and I quote the survey. For the first time in decades, the business environment in the United States is in danger of falling behind the rest of the world, end quote. That's bad news for everyone. A fundamentally weakened U.S. economy is not only an American problem, but also a global risk, end quote. Madam President, Chairman Camp and I have been working together for more than 2 years on comprehensive tax reform. Here in the Senate, I've been working on tax reform the past 3 years with my good friend, Senator Hatch, ranking member of the Finance Committee. We've held more than 30 hearings, heard from hundreds of experts on how the code can simplify this tax reform, can simplify the system for families, help businesses innovate, and make the United States more competitive. Madam President, a lot of people talk about more jobs. A lot of talk about more jobs. This is one way to get more jobs. Reform the tax code. It will unleash so much positive energy in this country. It will create a lot more jobs than any other plan I've recently heard of. We've held more than 30 hearings, heard from hundreds of experts on how the reform can simplify the system, help businesses innovate, and make the U.S. more competitive. Last month, Senator Hatch and I completed work with the Finance Committee on an extensive 3-month, top-to-bottom review of the tax code. We met as a full committee every week to collect feedback on different topics in tax reform and issued a series of 10 discussion papers to kick off that conversation. In an effort to include the entire Senate in our efforts, we recently called on all senators to partner with us and provide their input and ideas for reforming the code. Starting with a blank slate, we called on every senator to submit their proposals for what they want to see in the reformed code. This is an important exercise. Everyone needs to be involved. We need every senator to weigh in on tax reform. I might say the deadline is this Friday, tomorrow. I encourage all my colleagues to submit their ideas and make voices heard. I might say your constituents are certainly making their voices heard. We've heard from more than 10,000 comments and ideas so far through the website that Chairman Camp and I created called taxreform.gov. Actually, 10,258 responses to be exact. Overwhelmingly, Americans from every corner of our country are calling for a simplified tax code. People think they should not have to spend hours upon hours and hundreds of dollars to prepare their taxes, and I, for one, agree. Let me share a couple of submissions we've heard on our website. Jennifer from Hollywood, Maryland writes, quote, I've been doing my family's taxes for 22 years. This year, my husband suggested we use a tax service. Why? The tax code is too complicated. He was concerned we're missing deductions, end quote. Mike from Fort Collins, Colorado provides an example of the complexity of the code in his writing, and he says, quote, I have been a tax assistance volunteer for 19 years. It is difficult to tell someone who knows what a child is that there are actually 4 different definitions of a child in the tax law. Make the same definition apply across the entire tax code, he says. The best way is the simplest way. Wendy from Irvine, California writes, I don't mind paying taxes. We need education, infrastructure, and defense. What I do mind is that it's a complete mystery and a complete game to find every allowable deduction, and it is a significant burden as well as a significant expense to pay a qualified preparer. How does this come to be? My returns are 20 to 50 pages long. Why is it no more than just 2 pages? There must be a way to simplify the process, end quote. You know what? Wendy's right. There must be a way to simplify the process. Madam President, that's the same message Chairman Camp and I heard earlier this month in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were in the Twin Cities for the first in a series of trips we were taken across the country to speak with people about tax reform. We want to get out of Washington. We're doing it this summer. We're going to Philadelphia next Monday and get input and feedback from people on dealing with America's tax system. The one in St. Paul was a great trip. We met with leaders of 2 distinctly different types of American businesses. One, a U.S.-based multinational corporation with more than 85,000 employees. The other, a family-run baker with 85 employees. While dramatically different in size and in industry, they face similar challenges when it comes to dealing with America's tax code. And in conversation after conversation, we heard the same thing. We need a simpler tax code. St. Paul was just the first stop. As I mentioned, next trip's Philadelphia. Then we plan to go to the West Coast. We've got other trips planned over the next couple of months. We're going to talk to groups about how we can make the tax system fairer and easier to deal with. We want to learn how we can restore some confidence in the code. Our efforts on reform have been ramping up. We are continuing to build momentum. Reform provides a historic opportunity to give families certainty, spark growth, create jobs, make businesses more competitive. It can provide America a real shot in the arm. I'll conclude my remarks as I began them with a quote. These words are from our nation's 6th president, John Quincy Adams. President Adams said, patience and perseverance have a magical effect before which difficulties disappear and obstacles vanish, end quote. That's where we are, Madam President. We're patient, we're persevering. We have a lot to do here. Difficulties will disappear, obstacles vanish. The best result will be American people have a simpler, fairer code, provide more jobs. Yield the floor. And I thank my colleagues who are managing the pending bill for yielding time.
Make your motion. Go ahead and talk it up.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, I rise to describe a motion to recommit that I'm going to offer, and I'd like to discuss this if I could. So, Madam President, let me start by providing a little bit of context to why I'm offering this motion to recommit. And that has to start by reminding my colleagues about the Budget Control Act that was signed into law in 2011, about 2 years ago. In the Budget Control Act, which again, that's an act, not a bill, it's been signed into law, it is the existing law of the land, it established spending caps, limits on discretionary spending in a modest effort to try to bring out-of-control spending somewhat under control. So we have a statutory limit on how much the federal government is permitted to spend. It's a limit on both the defense side and the non-defense side. But it's a limit. It's an attempt to control that which has been so difficult to control in this town, which is federal spending. Now, I should point out that even if we abide by the spending caps that are in the existing law, so if we follow the law, we're still going to run a huge deficit. Next year, the deficit will be about $560 billion. That means next year, if we have the spending discipline of living within the law, we will still increase our total outstanding debt by more than $500 billion, and our debt as a percentage of our economy will rise to 76%. 76% debt to GDP ratio is already, our debt to GDP ratio is already higher than it should be. It's already costing us economic growth and jobs. It's going to rise further, and that's assuming we stick to the spending cap. I should point out that the way we got to this point is just spending on autopilot, just growing spending every year. I'll give you one example. Since 2000, total federal spending has doubled. That's the scale of the increases in spending that we've been experiencing here, and that's why we've been running huge deficits. We now have a massive debt, and the accumulated debt is causing this big drag on our economy and preventing us from having the kind of job growth that we ought to have. So here's my big concern, Madam President. The bill that we're considering right now, the Transportation-HUD bill, puts us on a direct path to bust the caps, to break the law, to spend even more than the statutory limits that we put in place just 2 years ago. Now, let me walk through how we get there. The fact is, under the Budget Control Act, the cap that's set on discretionary spending for the fiscal year we are currently debating, 2014, is $967 billion. That's the number. If you add up the spending sums for all of the appropriation bills that my Democratic friends want to pass, it adds up to $1.058 trillion. It's $91 billion more spending than is permitted under current law. It busts the caps by almost $100 billion. We can't afford this kind of spending. We can't afford the spending we're currently contemplated, much less another $100 billion nearly. Now, I should be clear. Any single bill doesn't bust the caps all by itself. It's what they do in combination. But this bill is one of a series that, in combination, is designed to bust the caps. And all you have to do is add up the total spending in each bill, and you get a number that is much greater than the cap, so it's very clear. This particular bill, by the way, is a huge increase. The Transportation-HUD bill spends over $54 billion in its current form, as currently contemplated. That is $5 billion more than in 2013. That's a 10% increase in just 1 year. It's almost $10 billion more than what the House proposed. It's even more money than what the President of the United States asked for in his own budget request. He did not ask for this much money. And yet here it is on the Senate floor, a bill that busts the cap increases spending dramatically and spends more money than the President even asks for at a time when we are running huge deficits that are costing us economic growth. This, Madam President, I think is a very bad idea. And so I have a motion, and I'm grateful to have the support of many of my colleagues, including Senator Shelby and Senator Hoeven, both who are appropriators. I think Senator Hoeven is intending to speak on in support of this motion. And let me just explain clearly what it will do. What my motion would do is send the bill back to committee with instructions to lower the spending in the bill to $45.455 billion. Now, that is a number that would be consistent with the spending cap. It would allocate an amount of money to this appropriation bill, the Transportation-HUD bill, in proportion to what the Transportation-HUD bill spends under the current fiscal year. It would do that for this next fiscal year. I'm not suggesting that I would go through and line by line make all the individual adjustments within the bill. I would leave that to the committee that has the most expertise on this, the Appropriations Committee. Let them do their work, but let them do it in a way that ends up with a product that's consistent with the law, consistent with the spending caps. Now, one point I should make about the spending caps in the Budget Control Act, I think there are some folks in this town who mistakenly think that since deficits have gotten a little smaller in recent years than they were in the past few years, that somehow we don't have a deficit problem anymore and we can just crank up spending. I've got to say I think that is a profoundly mistaken view, Madam President. We still have a huge problem with the spending path that we are on. A $500 billion deficit is a devastatingly large deficit. And as bad as that is, several years in the future, under current projections, and again, this assumes that we live within the law, within a few years, these deficits start to explode again, even beyond the current levels, which are already unacceptable. So I just think that this is a very, very important. This is the first appropriation bill that the Senate is considering this year. This is the one that's going to determine whether we're going to go down a path of disregarding the bipartisan, presidential-signed law of the land, which is in existence right now. This bill is designed to be part of a process to bust that wide open so that we spend more money that we can't afford. So, Madam President, I think that would be a huge mistake. This is a motion to recommit back to the committee, report out a bill where they can establish the priorities and the allocation within the limit, but set the limit at a level that's consistent with the caps. And so, Madam President, I move to commit S-1243 to the Committee on Appropriations with instructions to report back with such changes as may be necessary such that total budget authority for fiscal year 2014 is not greater than $45,455 million, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second?